Welcome back to my little channel. Now unfortunately I was planning to do a lot of stuff. I was working on Who Needs Feminism series, and I was planning on making another installment of E Pluribus Unum, but my computer died not too long ago, so I don't have the files that I wanted for it. I will retrieve them once that computer gets fixed, but till that time I'm going to do something else. And what I'm going to do today is I'm going to address a TED Talk by Mr. David Miliband. And why is this so interesting? Well, Mr. Miliband is basically a former politician in the UK who voted in favour of the Iraq war. He has also been coined to say that terrorism in itself is understandable and, well, it's never effective on its own, but there are circumstances in which it is effective. Yeah, that's the one. So we have someone who is in favor of war and in favor of terrorism. And now they're going to tell us, well, he is, why we should do more for the refugees. Refugees he in part created, and never mind. Let's start. I will have two videos responding to the TED Talk. There will be a long one and there will be a short one. This is going to be the long one.
I'm going to speak to you about the global refugee crisis, and my aim is to show you that this crisis is manageable, not unsolvable.
I can understand why he likes to think that the crisis is manageable and solvable. Maybe, just maybe, he feels partly guilty for it being there at all.
But also show you that this is as much about us and who we are as it is a trial of the refugees on the front line.
Yep, feeling responsible for people who kill themselves and each other halfway across the world is very important to us. We need to feel responsible for the fact that they are killing each other. Whether we have any influence in it or not is beyond the point. We should feel responsible to help these people, probably to kill each other better. Not quite sure on that.
For me, this is not just a professional obligation because I run an NGO supporting refugees and displaced people around the world. It's personal.
Oh yeah, I forgot to mention that. He basically is running an NGO called International Rescue Committee, if I'm not mistaken. And he has been estimated of having a salary of more than $500,000 a year. So yeah, damn right it's personal for him. I mean, that's a lot of money. I mean, it would have been personal for most of us at 10% of that, wouldn't it?
I love this picture. That really handsome guy on the right, that's not me. That's my dad, Ralph, in London in 1940 with his father, Samuel. They were Jewish refugees from Belgium. They fled the day the Nazis invaded. And I love this picture too. It's a group of refugee children arriving in England in 1946 from Poland. And in the middle is my mother, Mariam. She was sent to start a new life in a new country on her own at the age of 12.
Well, if we're sharing pictures, I would like to share this one of Banaz Mahmoud. She was born in Iraq and she was living in England, where she was forced to marry someone, an abusive husband who attacked her, and eventually she had enough of it and she bailed, she ran away, and she found someone else and she wanted to live with that person. So her father and her uncle had her raped and killed. These are the refugees you want to help. But you didn't help Banaz Mahmoud because she went to the police 5 times before she got killed because she was afraid of whatever would happen to her. And unfortunately, she was very justified in that fear. But these are not the people you worry about. You want to protect people like the father and the uncle. Kind of silly that is, isn't it? And I know I'm only giving one example, but according to the UK police in 2011, at least 2,823 so-called honor attacks happened. And no, not all honor attacks are murders, but a bunch of them are. And that bunch is pretty big. And this is still in a time when honor attacks are growing. Yet you want to bring in more of the people who deem to think honor attacking your daughter is a good thing. You might want to think about that a bit.
I know this. If Britain had not admitted refugees in the 1940s, I certainly would not be here today.
Yes, because we all know that European refugees fleeing from the Second World War are quite the same as Middle Eastern refugees, who are mostly men of a fighting age, who bring their ill practices to the Western world. Now don't get me wrong, I'm all in favor of helping genuine refugees. But unfortunately, we have rape epidemics in countries where a lot of refugees are helped because we give them the right to rape. And female refugees in refugee camps get attacked by male refugees. This is a bit different than what happened with the refugees that came to us during the Second World War. I mean, these refugees, whilst they also came from a war-torn country, and there were also problems, at least weren't this foul.
Yet 70 years on, the wheel has come full circle. The sound is of walls being built, vengeful political rhetoric, humanitarian values and principles on fire in the very countries that 70 years ago said, never again.
This is the problem that I have with you now, David Miliband. You simply do not see the difference between what happened during the Second World War and what's happening now. The thing is, during the Second World War, people were fleeing a war because otherwise they would get killed. They did not want to leave that country. Parents sent their children to the UK whilst they stayed in Poland themselves to try and defend the country. If we look at our current refugee crisis, which is often be called a migrant crisis at the moment, 70 to 80% of them are men in a fighting age. There are hardly women or children among them, though that's kind of offset because most of the men, even of fighting age, decided to call themselves children, and somehow we accept that. And if we look at countries like Germany or Sweden, which have been taking up the brunt of the refugees, migrants, they are facing huge problems, both in crime and sexual violence. But unfortunately, we're not allowed to mention that, because when we do, we might be taken off and thrown into prison, because we are to be silenced. Do you see an issue with that? Because I do. I surely do. Now don't get me wrong, I really want to help genuine refugees. But I don't really see a lot of genuine refugees. And unfortunately, the few genuine refugees that actually do come get attacked in the refugee camps in countries where they are thinking they are safe. But we do see a lot of refugees, and you couldn't see the air quotations I did there, not happy to go to the countries they are assigned to because they don't get enough money there. And once they are well enough and established into the refugee thing, they go on holiday to the country where they came from. I'm sorry, are we talking about the same problem as the refugees had during the Second World War? Because it seems to me we are not.
To statelessness and hopelessness for the victims of war. Last year, every minute, 24 more people were displaced from their homes by conflict, violence, and persecution. Another chemical weapon attack in Syria, the Taliban on the rampage in Afghanistan. Girls driven from their school in northeast Nigeria by Boko Haram. These are not people moving to another country to get a better life. They're fleeing for their lives.
And these people genuinely do need our help, yet we give it to men who do not.
It's a real tragedy that the world's most famous refugee can't come to speak to you here today. Many of you will know this picture. It shows the lifeless body of 5-year-old Aylan Kurdi, a Syrian refugee who died in the Mediterranean in 2015. He died alongside 3,700 others trying to get to Europe.
You see, this is the thing that those that speak in favor of the migrant crisis keep doing. They're pulling on our heartstrings. Can you see this poor boy who died because his parents took the stupid idea to get a small boat over the sea, and that boat sank, so people died. You can get safely to Europe from Syria. But yeah, no, I understand. We need to have our heartstring plucked because the poor refugees, well, two can play that game. Actually, I can't show you children that are the victim of terrorism in Europe. For one reason, because I really don't want to. But the second reason is because there are hardly any images to find, because the media makes damn well sure that we only see poor victims that fit the narrative that they're trying to push. And the narrative they're trying to push is, yeah, but the poor refugees. Won't you think of the poor refugees?
The next year, 2016, 5,000 people died. It's too late for them.
So why did they die? How did they die? Or more to the point, how is it our responsibility? How many people died in Africa? How many people died in Latin America? How many people have died recently in Venezuela? Is it up to Europe to fix all the ails of the world? Because I don't think it is. And worst of all, you talk about the people from Africa and the Middle East, but you ne'er mention the people from the Ukraine. Hell, Ukrainian people aren't even considered refugees in Europe. Poland is the only country that actually does anything for them. So there is this double standard as well. Can you explain that double standard? Or is it because this is not a war you're interested in? I mean, after all, it's only Russia.
But it's not too late for millions of others. It's not too late for people like Frederick. I met him in the Nyarugusu refugee camp in Tanzania. He's from Burundi. He wanted to know where could he complete his studies. He'd done 11 years of schooling. He wanted a 12th year. He said to me, I pray that my days do not end here in this refugee camp.
Burundi, you say? Okay, so they had this huge fight between the Hutus and the Tutsis. Both are basically black tribes, and they caused a lot of people being murdered and displaced. This has nothing to do with Europe. We couldn't stop it. We tried. And we're trying to help the people there, but we can't because the country is corrupt. So do we need to take in all the refugees from these countries? Don't get me wrong, I'm willing to try whatever we can to do to help them. But he is of a fighting age. He is able to become part of the solution. So why can't we help them with a solution? Why do we have to bring them here?
And it's not too late for Khaloud. Her parents were Palestinian refugees living in the Yarmouk refugee camp outside Damascus. She was born to refugee parents, and now she's a refugee herself in Lebanon. She's working for the International Rescue Committee to help other refugees. But she has no certainty at all about her future, where it is or what it holds.
I do feel for people like Khaloud, who came from one refugee to another refugee situation. But this is something we see in the Middle East a lot. And in all fairness, if we look at the Palestinian situation, yes, Israel is a bitch. They're doing a lot of things wrong, but they're not the only one wrong in that conflict. And Damascus used to be a safe place. So what happened there? Weren't other fanatics that created that problem there, did it? I mean, must have been Europe that did it, so now we need to come and help. But wait, it wasn't Europe. We don't need to help them. We want to help them, of course, and we should. Or should we? Because helping them does not mean let's bring them all here so they can fuck it up here. We need to create safe spaces there. We need to create a safe country. And unfortunately, that country does have a leader called Assad, but we don't like Assad, so we don't want to work with him. No, we much rather support organizations that are linked to ISIS and Al-Qaeda. I don't get this. You are in favor of creating refugees. You're not in favor of helping them.
This talk is about Frederick, about Halud, and about millions like them.
No, it's not. It's about your NGO and how you can keep them relevant by creating more and more feelings to support refugees, which will bring in more money for NGOs like yours. You are a vile human being.
Why they're displaced, how they survive, what help they need, and what our responsibilities are.
These are good questions, and where I am all in favor of helping people that need help, we need to first make very, very sure that when we offer help, we do so because we offer it. It is not our responsibility. Stop trying to make us responsible for helping people. Helping people is something you do out of the kindness of your heart, not out of the twisting of your arm.
I truly believe this, that the biggest question in the 21st century concerns our duty to strangers.
Says the man being paid more than $500,000 to make this a relevant issue. I'm sorry, I don't believe you. I disagree.
The future you is about your duties to strangers. You know better than anyone, the world is more connected than ever before.
And you have the duty to sacrifice. They only have the duty to take. Somehow, that didn't seem fair to me. Does it seem fair to you?
Yet the great danger is that we're consumed by our divisions. And there is no better test of that than how we treat refugees. Here are the facts. 65 million people displaced from their homes by violence and persecution last year. If it was a country, that would be the 21st largest country in the world.
And with about 510 million people living in Europe, of course, we are responsible for those 65 million people who are displaced. So that's like a little less than 10% of our total population in Europe, not the continent, but the United States of Europe, so to speak. And we are responsible for 65 million. What about roughly the other 7 billion people in the world? Do they have any responsibility? Or does it all go back to Europe? We need to help these people because you make money off of it. That's basically the whole story, isn't it? We need to help them so that NGOs like yours have a reason to exist. You're not helping. Well, you're helping yourself. You're lining your pockets. You can help a lot of people with $500,000 a year. But basically, with that $500,000, you're only helping yourself, your children, and your wife. For fuck's sake. And you're telling us, the poor, average, working class person in Europe, that we need to help people so that you can get your salary, so you can have an explanation why you are justified to get your salary. It is, Did I already say you're a vile human being?
Most of those people, about 40 million, stay within their own home country. But 25 million are refugees. That means they cross a border into a neighboring state. Most of them are living in poor countries, relatively poor, or lower middle-income countries, like Lebanon, where Khaloud is living. In Lebanon, 1 in 4 people is a refugee, a quarter of the whole population. And refugees stay for a long time. The average length of displacement is 10 years.
Okay, so this is the thing I have a problem with. The average time of displacement is longer than 10 years. I mean, in all fairness, we know of people being born in refugee camps in the Middle East and Africa, having children themselves in refugee camps in Africa and the Middle East. And this is what you want to bring to Europe. These problems need fixing, I agree, but bringing them here is not a solution. It's just displacing the problem to a new location. And the problem we can't fix because it's the people, it's the ideologies that cause it. And yes, I know there are people out there who are going to say, well, but the Western world is creating all these wars. And you know what? Maybe you are right. I'm going to grant you that maybe you are right. I wonder how many Western factions are fighting in Syria at the moment. And I'm guessing it's not the Western world attacking Yemen. I'm really sure that you can give me a good explanation why the Western world started the sudden increase in war in Sudan, which basically turned into a civil war and now created 2 countries. And I'm 100% interested in hearing how the Hutus and Tutsis were killing each other because of the Western world. Can we stop with the blame? Can we look at the problem? And can we recognize it isn't ours? It's good that we want to help. It's bad that we're forced to help.
I went to what was the world's largest refugee camp in eastern Kenya. It's called Dadaab. It was built in 1991-92 as a quote-unquote temporary camp for Somalis fleeing the civil war. I met Silo, and naively I said to Silo, do you think you'll ever go home to Somalia? And she said, what do you mean go home? I was born here.
And yet you still claim that the average displacement time is 10 years. She looks a lot older than 10 years. And to her, that is home. So imagine if you would have brought them to Europe and she would have been born in Europe, Europe would have been her home. Now don't get me wrong, I don't mind getting people here. I don't mind to help genuine refugees. Hell, I don't even care to bring in economic migrants as long as the country can handle it. But that's not what you're talking about. You're talking about bringing in here anyone who needs our help. And who decides whether they need our help? Well, they do, and you do. And you get paid for it to help them. And how do you help them? By displacing them. So you're not really helping them at all. You're getting paid to do fuck all. And you want us to help you with that. But you're not going to share your pay now, are you?
And then when I asked the camp management how many of the 330,000 people in that camp were born there, they gave me the answer. 100,000. That's what long-term displacement means. Now, the causes of this are deep. Weak states that can't support their own people, an international political system weaker than at any time since 1945, and differences over theology, governance, engagement with the outside world in significant parts of the Muslim world.
You're forgetting one point. You're forgetting NGOs or companies that are making money by human trafficking, you vile piece of...
Now, those are long-term, generational challenges. That's why I say that this refugee crisis is a trend and not a blip. And it's complex. And when you have big, large, long-term, complex problems, people think nothing can be done. When Pope Francis went to Lampedusa, off the coast of Italy in 2014, he accused all of us and the global population of what he called the globalization of indifference. It's a haunting phrase. It means that our hearts have turned to stone. Now, I don't know, you tell me, are you allowed to argue with the Pope?
Considering the amount of refugee the Pope has taken into his country, Vatican City, I'm going to say, yes, I am allowed to argue with the Pope, and I have a damn good argument. Because if he feels it's so important to help the refugees, how come there are none in Vatican City? But I'm pretty sure there's going to be a very good explanation why other people have to do it, because... But that's basically what you're telling us too. We need to help the refugees because it's a circular motion. It's a circular logic. There's a problem there. We need to help them, and with we, I mean you, so that I can get paid and I can blame you. Are you feeling guilty yet? Because if not, I can go on for a while. Just as long as you remember that I'm doing this for the good of the world and $600,000. Never mind that.
Even at a TED conference? But I think it's not right. I think people do want to make a difference, but they just don't know whether there are any solutions to this crisis. And what I want to tell you today is that though the problems are real, the solutions are real too. Solution one, these refugees need to get into work in the countries where they're living, and the countries where they're living need massive economic support. In Uganda in 2014, they did a study. 80% of refugees in the capital city Kampala needed no humanitarian aid because they were working, they were supported into work. Solution number two, education for kids is a lifeline, not a luxury when you're displaced for so long. Kids can bounce back when they're given the proper social, emotional support alongside literacy and numeracy. I've seen it for myself. But half of the world's refugee children of primary school age get no education at all, and 3/4 of secondary school age get no education at all. That's crazy.
Yeah, I have to admit, schooling is a good thing for kids. Not just for kids, for adults too. But unfortunately, among the refugees, there's a large group that is ideologically and theocratically driven, and they're quite against schooling, especially schooling that they do not affirm, especially schooling that doesn't consider their worldview the primary worldview. So, are we going to address that? And if we're not going to address that, then nothing is going to change.
Solution number three, most refugees are in urban areas, in cities, not in camps. What would you or I want if we were a refugee in a city? We'd want money to pay rent or buy clothes. That is the future of the humanitarian system, or a significant part of it. Give people cash so that you boost the power of refugees and actually you help the local economy.
So, Western countries that are going through an economic crisis themselves for the last, I want to say 10 years, need to give money to refugees, even though their own population doesn't really have money. Don't you see that there's going to be a huge problem with that? We already see this in the Western world. We already see this in Europe. We have refugees getting money to give them a good life, which is more than the average person in that country has. Don't you see how this is going to fail? And it's going to bankrupt countries because they have to loan money to make sure that they can keep doing this. But the refugees that do come do not contribute to the countries. So it's money that is basically lost. So how is this a good idea? Now, funny enough, Denmark is one of the countries that basically said, okay, refugees, you are welcome here, but if you do have wealth, we want you to pay for your stay. And if you are able to work, you should. And the Western world fell over them. How can you ask this of people? Oh no, the poor refugees, you need to give them. Well, but why can't they contribute themselves? Actually, I agreed with Denmark on this. But the Western world apparently doesn't. But I'm getting sidetracked here. Continue with your rant.
And there's a fourth solution too, that's controversial but needs to be talked about. The most vulnerable refugees need to be given a new start and a new life in a new country, including in the West. The numbers are relatively small, hundreds of thousands, not millions. But the symbolism is huge. Now is not the time to be banning refugees, as the Trump administration proposed. It's a time to be embracing people who are victims of terror.
But these victims of terror are not the indigenous people of Sweden, Germany, Belgium, France, or the UK, right? We need to bring in more people to these countries so that they can get enriched by these terrorisms. Don't you understand that you are basically proving everyone right, that you are a talking head trying to shill your own stories and line your own pockets? Unfortunately, there are only a few countries in Europe that do not have refugee enforced terrorism. And yes, I do call them refugee enforced terrorism because the link between the terrorists and the refugees are unfortunately too big. And I know, not all refugees. I know. But why can't we say, but still too many? Because you have no problem whatsoever to talk about how a poor boy dies when their parents try to flee to Europe in a rinky-dink boat, but you'd never mention the people dying in Europe because of the terrorists that show their gratitude by blowing up an Ariana Grande concert in Manchester, or drive a truck in Nice over a bunch of people, or do the same thing in Sweden. No, those refugees, well, it's merely a side effect. We can't help that. That's the thing though, we can, by not taking in that many refugees. Or at all, it seems, because some countries seem to think that that's a good idea. And the funny thing is, when we talk about refugees, we always talk about refugees from Africa and the Middle East. No one is mentioning the Ukraine. The double standard in this, and the irony in this, is beyond. I'm sorry. This is the long version, and I'm going to end it here, or at least I'm going to end my rant, and I'm going to stop showing the TED Talk. We are being filled with lies. We're built up to believe, that we are the solution to a problem that, well, we might not have created, but are partly responsible for. The responsibility always rests with us. And oh, look at that bad Trump. He's not allowing these refugees in. Yeah, but there's a reason they're not allowing these refugees in, or at least not unvetted. And that's why Trump, wanted to have that travel ban. Why aren't we vetting our refugees? We used to, but we haven't for the last few years. And look what it did to the terrorism count in Europe. Oh well, but it's part and parcel of living in big cities, according to a mayor I will not name further. Don't you see that by your narrative, you're not creating a safe world for anyone? You're displacing a problem to Europe, and with that problem come the killings, the honor killings, the terrorism, and somehow the native population of Europe, well, they just have to deal with it. I mean, it's quite normal to live in a world where you have a lot of terrorism. And this is happening in every major country. That's why there are so many terrorist attacks in Japan. Oh no, wait, there aren't. Well, Hong Kong is a massive bed of terrorism. Oh no, wait, it's not. But Shanghai, one of the most populated places in the world, people dropping dead like flies because of terrorism. Or are they? The double standard you're pushing and the blame you're putting on the Western world is terrifying to me. People actually listen to you. And then they forget that you get $500,000 in pay to tell these sorts of shit stories. Don't get me wrong, the people in refugee camps are genuine problem people. They need help. But it's not helping them to bring them here unvetted, because among the refugees are criminals. Not all refugees. Hashtag not all. I understand. but hashtag too many. And the worst part is that the refugees that do come here to really want to work on themselves and really give themselves a second chance on a safe place, we are ignoring. We don't care about them. They are victims in Germany, in Sweden, of rape and of, well, all sorts of violence perpetrated to them by other refugees. And in Sweden, there have been refugees who have been caught raping, and instead of kicking them out of the country, they just moved them to other refugee camps. Why? Because of narratives like the one you're pushing. Anyway, this is the end of my little response. Like, share, subscribe if you feel so inclined. Criticism, as always, is more than welcome. And this is the long version. There's also a short version. You might like the short version too. You might like the short version better than this one. Let me know. And have a good one.